The sound of the pregnancy test falling onto the cold bathroom floor echoed like a hammer hitting the morning silence. Emily Carter stood frozen, staring at the small white device that had become her monthly tormentor for the past 3 years. Once again, a single line. Once again, the cruel confirmation that her body refused to cooperate with the dreams she and Michael had built together. She let herself slide down the wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, hugging her knees against her chest. The chill of the marble stones penetrated through the thin fabric of her nightgown, but she barely noticed. Physical pain was insignificant compared to the emptiness that expanded inside her like a black hole, sucking away any hope she still dared to maintain. From the adjacent room, she could hear Michael moving around, probably preparing for another day at the investment firm where he worked in downtown Seattle. He wouldn't ask about the result. He didn't need to. One look into her eyes would tell him everything. 3 years of trying, 2 years of treatments, countless medical appointments, and the result was always the same. Unexplained infertility, as doctors liked to classify it when they couldn't find a specific cause for the problem. Emily stood up and walked to the sink, avoiding looking at her reflection in the mirror. She didn't want to see the swollen eyes, the empty expression that had become her trademark in recent weeks. She washed her face with cold water, trying to erase the traces of tears she had shed the night before, when she had found Michael assembling the crib they had bought with such optimism 6 months ago. "Maybe this time," he had said, tightening the screws with meticulous care. "Maybe it's our turn." The hope in his voice hurt more than any accusation could have hurt. Michael never blamed her, never showed frustration or anger, just infinite patience that made her feel even more broken. She left the bathroom and found Michael in the kitchen preparing coffee for both of them. His movements were precise, automatic, the routine of a couple who had learned to navigate their days without mentioning the elephant in the room. He wore the gray suit she had chosen for him at Nordstrom, the one that highlighted his blue eyes. Under other circumstances, she would have commented on how elegant he looked. Now the words seemed stuck in her throat. "Good morning," Michael said without turning around. His voice carried that caution she had learned to recognize, the tone he used when he knew she had taken the test earlier and didn't want to pressure her for the result. "Good morning," she replied, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. The liquid was at the perfect temperature with the exact amount of cream she liked. Small gestures of love that continued even when everything around them seemed to be crumbling. They had coffee in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Through the kitchen window, Emily could see Elliott Bay stretching under the typical gray April sky in Seattle. Small boats dotted the water's surface, heading in directions she envied. They all had a destination, a purpose, a clear direction. She felt like a drifting vessel without compass or sails. Their apartment in Belltown had been chosen with a future family in mind. 3 bedrooms, recreational area, good school in the neighborhood. Now, the spare room had become a silent repository of unrealized hopes. The disassembled crib leaning against the wall, boxes of baby clothes she couldn't donate or throw away, maternity books gathering dust on the shelves. "I need to go," Michael said, kissing her forehead gently. "The meeting with the Japanese investors is at 9. Emily nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good luck with the presentation." He hesitated at the door, as if he wanted to say something more but just waved and left. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty apartment, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts and the suffocating weight of silence. She wandered through the rooms without a defined purpose, her bare feet finding the soft living room carpet. On the coffee table, there were still maternity magazines she had subscribed to in a moment of naive optimism. Smiling faces of pregnant women stared at her from the covers, their rounded bellies like symbols of everything she couldn't achieve. The phone rang, interrupting her dark thoughts. Her best friend Jessica's name flashed on the screen. Emily contemplated not answering, but knew Jessica would persist until she managed to talk to her. "Hi, Jess," Emily said, trying to inject some joy into her voice. "How are you?" Jessica asked, and Emily could hear a baby crying in the background. James, 6 months old, the son Jessica had conceived effortlessly right after marriage. "I'm fine," Emily lied, feeling like a bad actress trying to convince a skeptical audience. "Emily," Jessica began, and she recognized the tone. It was the same one everyone used when they wanted to offer advice or comfort about her situation. "Have you thought about adoption? Or maybe taking a break from treatments?" Emily closed her eyes, feeling the familiar wave of irritation mixed with sadness. Everyone had a solution, a story about someone they knew who had gone through the same problem and found a magical way out. As if she hadn't explored every possibility, as if she hadn't researched every available alternative. "Maybe," Emily replied, knowing it was the answer Jessica wanted to hear. After ending the call, Emily sat on the living room sofa, hugging a pillow against her chest. The apartment around her seemed to mock her inability. The ample space that should be filled with scattered toys and children's laughter remained impeccably tidy, like a showcase of a life she couldn't live. She thought about Michael, probably at that moment explaining investment charts to suited men in a conference room overlooking the city. He was good at what he did, respected, successful. He could create wealth for other people, build financial empires, but he couldn't give her the only thing that really mattered. Emily got up and walked to the room that should have been the baby's. The door had remained closed in recent weeks, but today she felt the need to enter. The disassembled crib greeted her like a skeleton of dead dreams. The walls, painted neutral yellow, because they wanted the surprise of the gender, seemed to fade with each passing day. She sat on the floor and opened one of the boxes of baby clothes. Small jumpsuits, onesies with animal prints, tiny shoes that seemed made for dolls. Each piece represented an excited shopping afternoon, moments when she allowed herself to dream about the future, imagining what it would be like to dress her child in these clothes. Tears came without warning, silent and abundant. Emily cried for the child who never came, for the marriage that was wearing away under the weight of unrealized expectations, for the version of herself that had been lost somewhere in the midst of so many medical appointments and failed treatments. That's when she heard the doorbell ring. Reluctantly, she got up and went to answer, not expecting anyone. On the other side of the door was an elegant woman, around 50 years old, wearing an impeccable suit and carrying a leather briefcase. "Ms. Carter?" the woman asked, consulting a paper in her hands. "Yes, that's me," Emily replied, confused. "My name is Helen Morrison. I represent Whitmore Holdings. We received a recommendation about your interior design work through a mutual acquaintance. We would like to offer you a quite unique work opportunity." Emily blinked, trying to process the information. She had worked as an interior designer before marriage, but had paused her career to focus on fertility treatments and plans to start a family. "What kind of opportunity?" Emily asked, curious despite herself. "A complete renovation in a property in Medina," Helen explained, referring to the exclusive neighborhood where some of the richest men in the country lived. The project would last approximately 6 months, with very competitive salary and the possibility of accommodation on the property if necessary. Emily held the door, feeling something stir inside her for the first time in months. It wasn't exactly hope, but a curiosity about what could be different if she left the suffocating routine her life had become. "Can I think about it?" she asked. Helen smiled. "Of course. Here's my card. But don't take too long. The client is quite impatient when he makes a decision." After Helen left, Emily stood at the door, holding the elegant card. For the first time in 3 years, an opportunity had appeared that had nothing to do with basal temperatures, ovulation, or fertile windows. It was just work, creativity, the chance to build something beautiful for someone else. She looked back at the apartment that had become a prison of unrealized expectations, then forward, where the hallway stretched toward the elevator. Maybe it was time to discover who she could be when she wasn't trying to become a mother. Maybe it was time to remember that there were other ways to create, other forms of giving life to something. Emily closed the door and walked to the phone, Helen's card still in her hands. For 6 months, she could be just Emily Carter, interior designer, not Emily Carter, the woman who couldn't get pregnant. It was a beginning. 3 days later, Emily found herself driving through the gates of what could only be described as a modern fortress. The Whitmore estate in Medina sprawled across perfectly manicured grounds, with towering evergreens providing privacy from the curious eyes of neighbors. Though at this level of wealth, neighbors were more like distant concepts than actual people living nearby. The main house was a masterpiece of contemporary architecture, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the gray Seattle sky. Emily parked her modest Honda Civic next to a fountain that probably cost more than her annual salary, feeling suddenly self-conscious about her choice to accept this position. Helen Morrison emerged from the front entrance before Emily could even gather her portfolio from the passenger seat. Today, the woman wore a cream-colored blazer that screamed expensive simplicity, and her smile was as professionally polished as her appearance. "Ms. Carter, wonderful to see you again. I trust the drive wasn't too difficult?" "Not at all," Emily replied, shouldering her leather bag. "The directions were perfect." "Excellent. Now, I should mention that Mr. Whitmore is particular about his privacy and his time. He's agreed to meet with you personally, which is unusual. Most contractors deal exclusively through me." Helen's tone carried a warning that Emily didn't quite understand yet. They walked through an impressive foyer where Emily's footsteps echoed, despite the Persian rug scattered across the marble floor. Original artwork adorned the walls, pieces she recognized from art history textbooks, the kind that belonged in museums rather than private homes. "The renovation will focus primarily on the West Wing," Helen explained as they walked. "Mr. Whitmore acquired the property 2 years ago but has been dissatisfied with the previous designer's vision. He terminated that contract rather abruptly." Before Emily could ask what rather abruptly meant, they stopped in front of tall oak doors. Helen knocked twice and entered without waiting for a response. "Sir, Ms. Carter is here for the consultation." The study was a study in controlled masculinity, dark wood, leather-bound books, and a desk that could double as a small aircraft carrier. Behind it sat a man who made Emily's breath catch in her throat, though not entirely for pleasant reasons. Alexander Whitmore was younger than she'd expected, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, and sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance in the span of a heartbeat. He didn't stand when she entered, didn't smile, didn't offer any of the social niceties she'd grown accustomed to in her previous work. "Ms. Carter." His voice was deep, with the kind of authority that suggested he'd never had to repeat himself. "Helen tells me you're supposedly talented." The supposedly hit her like a small slap. Emily straightened her shoulders, calling on reserves of confidence she'd forgotten she possessed. "I am. Would you like to see my portfolio? Or would you prefer to continue making assumptions?" Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment, Emily wondered if she'd just talked herself out of the job. Then something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "Show me," he said simply. For the next 20 minutes, Emily walked him through her previous projects. A boutique hotel renovation in Capitol Hill, several high-end residential redesigns, the restaurant space that had won her a local design award 3 years ago. Alexander listened without comment, his expression unreadable, occasionally flipping through the photographs with fingers that Emily noticed were long and surprisingly elegant for such a clearly controlling man. "The hotel project," he said finally. "What was your budget?" $2.3 million, Emily replied. "Timeline?" 8 months, completed 2 weeks early. "Why did the previous owner sell?" Emily blinked. "I'm sorry. What does that have to do with my design work?" "Everything. If you're going to redesign a space, you need to understand why the previous vision failed. You need to understand the psychology of the space, not just the aesthetics." Despite her irritation at his condescending tone, Emily had to admit he had a point. The previous owners ran it as a traditional business hotel, too corporate, no personality. Seattle's market was moving toward boutique experiences and they couldn't adapt quickly enough. Alexander nodded slowly. "And how do you know I won't have the same problem with adaptability?" "I don't," Emily said honestly. "But unlike a hotel, this is your private residence. The only person who needs to be satisfied with the result is you. That makes my job easier and harder at the same time." "Explain." Easier because I only have one client to please instead of trying to appeal to mass market sensibilities. Harder because— She paused, studying his face. Because you strike me as someone who's very difficult to please. Helen made a small sound that might have been surprise or alarm, but Alexander leaned back in his chair, and Emily caught the hint of a genuine smile. Helen, leave us, he said without taking his eyes off Emily. Sir, I really think— Close the door behind you. After Helen's reluctant departure, Alexander stood and walked to the window that overlooked the estate's back gardens. Even in the gray afternoon light, Emily could see the careful planning that had gone into the landscape design. Rolling lawns that led to a private dock on Lake Washington, mature trees positioned to provide both privacy and beauty. Tell me something, Ms. Carter. What do you see when you look at this room? Emily glanced around the study again, really looking this time instead of just cataloging expensive objects. I see someone who values tradition, but isn't bound by it. The furniture is classic but not antique, expensive but not ostentatious. I see someone who works too much, probably eats most of his meals at this desk, and— She hesitated. And someone who's lonely, but has convinced himself that solitude is a choice rather than a circumstance. Alexander turned from the window, his green eyes sharp and unreadable. That's quite an assessment based on furniture arrangement. You asked what I see. I see spaces the way other people read body language. This room is beautiful, functional, impressive, but it's not lived in. It's performed in. And what would you do differently? Emily walked to the seating area near the fireplace, noting how the chairs were positioned for conversation, but angled slightly away from each other, as if even in potential intimacy, distance was maintained. I'd start by figuring out how you actually want to live, not how you think you should live. When you're not working, not entertaining, not performing the role of Alexander Whitmore, successful businessman, what do? What makes you feel calm? Something shifted in his expression, a small crack in the armor of professional distance. It's been a long time since I've thought about feeling calm. The admission was quiet, almost involuntary, and Emily felt something unexpected. A flutter of sympathy for this man who seemed to have everything and somehow still gave the impression of having nothing that truly mattered. The West Wing, she said gently. Is that going to be your personal living space? Eventually. Right now it's underutilized. May I see it? Alexander hesitated, then nodded. He led her through corridors lined with more impressive artwork, past a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a high-end restaurant, to a wing of the house that felt distinctly different. Here, the rooms were empty, echoing, filled with the kind of potential that made Emily's designer instincts sing. The previous designer wanted to create an entertainment suite, Alexander said, his tone suggesting what he thought of that idea. Home theater, game room, bar area. Very masculine, she said. But that's not what you want. No. He paused in what would have been the main living area, sunlight streaming through windows that offered a stunning view of the lake. I want— What? I want it to feel like home. Not like a showpiece, not like a hotel, like home. The word came out quietly, almost uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to want such a simple thing. Emily felt her heart do something unexpected, a small skip that had nothing to do with professional interest and everything to do with the vulnerability she'd just glimpsed. I can do that, she said softly. I can help you build a home. Alexander looked at her then. Really looked, and for a moment the distance between them felt charged with possibility. Not romantic possibility. Emily was too raw for that, too focused on survival to even consider such complications. But the possibility of understanding, of creating something meaningful together. The position includes accommodation on the property, he said. There's a guest cottage near the gardens. You're welcome to use it or commute from your home. Whatever you prefer. Emily thought about her empty apartment, about the rooms that echoed with absence, about Michael's careful kindness that was becoming harder to bear with each passing day. The cottage sounds perfect, she heard herself say. Alexander nodded. Helen will handle the contracts and logistics. When can you start? Is Monday too soon? Monday is perfect." He extended his hand, and when Emily shook it, she was surprised by the warmth of his palm, the steadiness of his grip. "Welcome to Whitmore Holdings, Ms. Carter." "Emily," she said. "If we're going to build you a home, you should probably call me Emily." Emily. The way he said her name was careful, as if he was testing how it felt. "Alexander." As they walked back toward the main house, Emily felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation for tomorrow. Not the desperate hope that had characterized her fertility treatments, but genuine curiosity about what she might create in those empty rooms, what kind of home she might help this enigmatic man build. She didn't notice the way Alexander glanced at her as they walked, or the way his expression had softened slightly. She was too busy imagining color palettes and furniture arrangements, too focused on the creative challenge ahead, to realize that something had shifted between them in that empty wing of the house, something that felt remarkably like the beginning of hope. The guest cottage was a revelation Emily hadn't expected. Tucked between towering Douglas firs and overlooking a private garden that bordered Lake Washington, it felt like a sanctuary designed for someone who understood the healing power of beautiful spaces. French doors opened onto a stone terrace where morning coffee could be enjoyed while watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink. Emily stood in the cottage's main room on her first morning, sipping coffee from a mug she'd found in the perfectly appointed kitchen, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the desperate quiet of her apartment where silence amplified absence, but genuine tranquility that seemed to seep into her bones. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "How's the new job? House okay for staying over?" She stared at the message for several minutes before typing back, "Beautiful place. Job seems promising. We'll call tonight." It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. She hadn't told him about the duration of the project, about how she'd essentially moved out of their shared apartment without really discussing it. The guilt sat heavy in her stomach, but not as heavy as the relief of being somewhere David's ghost couldn't follow her. A soft knock on the cottage door interrupted her thoughts. Emily opened it to find a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "You must be Emily. I'm Margaret Torres, the house manager. Mr. Whitmore asked me to check if you need anything for settling in." "That's very thoughtful. Thank you. Everything is perfect, actually." "This cottage is incredible." Margaret's smile warmed. It was designed by the previous owner's daughter. She was an artist, wanted a space for retreats and creative work. Mr. Whitmore had it restored when he bought the property, though I don't think anyone's actually stayed here until now. "Why not?" "Mr. Whitmore doesn't entertain much. Prefers his privacy." Margaret paused, studying Emily's face. "Helen mentioned you're working on the West Wing renovation. That'll be good for him." "Good for him?" "That wing's been empty since he moved in. Sometimes I catch him standing in those rooms just looking, like he's trying to figure out what should go there." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. Maybe what he needed was someone who understands that a house isn't the same as a home. After Margaret left, Emily gathered her materials and walked to the main house. Alexander had given her a key card and the security codes, trusting her with access that felt significant even if he'd presented it matter-of-factly. She found him in the kitchen, standing at the granite island with a laptop open and a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He wore dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his green eyes more pronounced, looking more approachable than he had in his business suit the previous week. "Good morning," Emily said. "I hope you don't mind me coming through the main house." Alexander looked up and she caught a flash of something that might have been surprise, not at her presence but at how natural her greeting had sounded. "Of course not. Coffee's fresh if you want some. I actually wanted to ask you a few questions before I start sketching ideas for the West Wing." "Fire away." He closed the laptop, giving her his full attention in a way that felt both flattering and slightly unnerving. Emily pulled out her notebook. "What time of day do you feel most yourself?" Alexander blinked. "What kind of question is that?" "An important one. Some people are morning people who feel energized by sunrise. Others are night owls who think better after dark. Some feel most centered during the quiet of afternoon. If I'm designing your personal space, I need to know when you're most you. He considered this seriously. Early evening, I think. After work is done, but before the night feels too long. Emily made a note. And what do you do during those times? When you're not working, not handling business calls? He paused, looking almost confused by the question. I don't know. I usually keep working. But if you didn't have to, if you had nowhere to be, nothing urgent to handle, what would draw your attention? Alexander walked to the kitchen window that faced the lake. I used to read. Before I started the company, before everything became about growth and acquisitions and board meetings, I used to lose hours in books. What kind of books? History, mostly. Biographies of people who built things that lasted. His voice carried a note of something Emily couldn't quite identify. Nostalgia, maybe, or regret. What else? I like cooking, though I rarely have time for it. I mean really cooking, not just heating something up. There's something satisfying about creating something with your hands, about the precision required. Emily made another note, beginning to see the shape of what Alexander needed. Do you have people over? Friends? Family? Not really. The answer came quickly, automatically, and Emily heard the defensiveness in it. By choice or circumstance? Alexander turned back to face her, his expression guarded. Does it matter? It matters for the design. A space meant for solitude feels different from a space that could accommodate connection, even if you don't use it that way often. He was quiet for so long, Emily wondered if she'd pushed too far. Finally, he said, I used to have friends, before the company took off, before I became... He gestured vaguely at the expensive kitchen around them. This version of myself. And now? Now I have business associates and employees and people who want things from me. It's easier to just... He shrugged. Easier to keep things simple. Emily felt a familiar ache. The loneliness she recognized because she'd been living in her own version of it. Different circumstances, same isolation. Okay, she said gently. One more question. If you could wave a magic wand and the West Wing would be exactly what you need it to be, what would you feel when you walked into it? Alexander's green eyes met hers. And for a moment she saw past the successful businessman to something more vulnerable underneath. I'd feel like I could breathe, he said quietly. Like I could stop performing and just exist. Emily felt her heart do that small skip again. The same reaction she'd had when he'd admitted wanting a home. I can work with that, she said. She spent the next 3 hours in the empty West Wing, taking measurements and notes, letting ideas percolate as she moved through the spaces. Alexander had given her a generous budget and complete creative control, a level of trust that both thrilled and intimidated her. Around noon, she heard footsteps and turned to find Alexander in the doorway of what would become the main living area. How's it going? He asked. Good. I'm starting to see the bones of it. Emily gestured toward the windows. The natural light in here is incredible. It would be a shame to fight against it. What do you mean? A lot of designers would want to make this dramatic. Dark colors, heavy furniture, very masculine and imposing. But this space wants to be warm and inviting. It wants to breathe. Alexander stepped into the room, looking around as if seeing it through her eyes. You really think spaces want things? Don't you? When you walk into a room, don't you immediately get a sense of how it feels? Whether it's welcoming or cold, energetic or peaceful? I suppose I do. He moved to stand beside her near the windows. What does this room want to be? Emily closed her eyes briefly, letting herself feel the space. It wants to be a place where someone successful and driven can remember how to be still. It wants books and comfortable seating and maybe a fireplace that actually gets used. It wants to prove that luxury doesn't have to mean loneliness. When she opened her eyes, Alexander was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You really see all that? I see someone who's forgotten how to live in his own life, Emily said softly. And I think this space could help you remember. Something shifted between them in that moment. Not romantic tension exactly, but a recognition of shared understanding. Two people who had somehow lost their way, finding themselves in an empty room full of possibility. "Margaret's making lunch," Alexander said after a moment. "Would you like to join me? We could discuss the project timeline?" Emily nodded, though she suspected the timeline wasn't really what either of them wanted to talk about. "I'd like that." As they walked back toward the main house, Emily felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since David's accident, she was thinking about creating something new rather than mourning something lost. And though she tried not to analyze it too deeply, she was beginning to look forward to these conversations with Alexander, to the careful way he considered her questions, to the glimpses of the person he might be when he allowed himself to stop performing. It felt remarkably like the beginning of something she wasn't quite ready to name. 2 weeks into the project, Emily had established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings in the cottage with coffee and sketches. Afternoons in the West Wing taking measurements and coordinating with contractors. Evenings reviewing fabric samples and furniture catalogs. It was the first time in months that her days had structure that didn't revolve around doctor's appointments or fertility charts. She was kneeling on the floor of what would become Alexander's private study, arranging paint samples in the afternoon light, when she heard his voice from the main living area. "The Yamamoto deal is non-negotiable, Richard. They either accept our terms or we walk." His tone was sharp, all business, the voice of someone accustomed to getting his way. Emily tried to focus on her color selections, but Alexander's voice carried clearly through the empty rooms. She caught fragments of conversation about stock options and acquisition timelines, the language of high-stakes business that reminded her how different their worlds were. "No, I don't care if they think it's aggressive. Aggressive gets results." A pause. "Richard, I built this company from nothing. I'm not going to apologize for knowing what I want." The call ended abruptly, followed by what sounded like Alexander's phone hitting a wall. Emily winced, then heard his footsteps approaching the study. "Sorry," he said from the doorway, his voice tight with frustration. "Didn't realize you were working in here." Emily looked up from her paint samples. Alexander stood with his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw set in a way that suggested the phone call hadn't gone well. The carefully controlled businessman from their earlier conversations had been replaced by someone raw and irritated. "Rough day?" she asked gently. "Rough year." He ran a hand through his dark hair, leaving it disheveled. "Nothing a few $1 million can't solve, supposedly. But that's not really how it works, is it?" Alexander's green eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" Emily set down the paint samples and stood, brushing dust from her knees. "Money solves practical problems. It doesn't solve—" She gestured vaguely, searching for the right words. "It doesn't solve the problems that keep you awake at 3 in the morning. And what would you know about my 3 a.m. problems?" The question came out harsher than Emily thought he'd intended, and she saw him wince slightly at his own tone. But instead of backing away, she found herself stepping closer. "I know what it's like to have everything look perfect from the outside while feeling empty on the inside," she said quietly. "I know what it's like to smile and nod when people tell you how lucky you are, when all you want to do is scream that lucky doesn't feel like this." Something in Alexander's expression cracked. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Emily held his gaze. "You live in a house that could fit 50 people, but you eat most of your meals alone. You've built a successful company, but you just told me you don't have real friends anymore. You have enough money to buy anything you want, but you can't figure out how to make your own home feel like home." "Stop." The word came out rough, almost desperate. "You asked me to design a space where you could stop performing and just exist," Emily continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "But you don't even know who you are when you're not performing, do you?" Alexander turned away from her, walking to the windows that overlooked the lake. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that screamed control, even as Emily sensed he was anything but controlled. "You don't understand," he said finally. "When you build something from nothing, when you're responsible for hundreds of employees and millions in revenue, you don't get the luxury of existential crises." Says who? Says reality. Says the board of directors who expect quarterly growth. Says the investors who trust me with their money. His voice was tight with strain. Says everyone who depends on Alexander Whitmore, successful businessman, not whoever the hell I might be underneath that. Emily moved to stand beside him at the window, close enough to feel the tension radiating from his body but not quite touching. When's the last time you did something just because it made you happy? I don't remember. The admission came out so quietly, Emily almost didn't hear it. When she looked at his profile, she saw something that made her chest tighten. A loneliness so profound it made her own struggles feel small by comparison. Alexander, she said softly. When's the last time someone asked how you were doing and you told them the truth? He turned to face her then, and Emily was startled by the vulnerability in his green eyes. The truth? The truth. I'm exhausted, he said, the words falling between them like stones. I'm so tired of being responsible for everything, of having every decision analyzed and second-guessed. I'm tired of dinner meetings and conference calls and pretending that acquiring another company will somehow fill the... He stopped, shaking his head. Fill the what? The emptiness. The constant feeling that no matter how much I achieve, it's never enough. Never meaningful. Emily felt tears prick her eyes, not for herself this time, but for the man standing before her who had everything and somehow still had nothing that really mattered. I understand, she whispered. Do you? I spent 3 years defining myself by one thing, trying to get pregnant. Every month was a failure. Every negative test was proof that I wasn't good enough, wasn't woman enough, wasn't enough, period. Emily's voice caught slightly. I forgot that I was other things too, that I was creative and capable and... She paused, meeting his gaze. That I was more than my worst disappointment. Alexander studied her face with an intensity that made Emily feel exposed, as if he was seeing all the broken pieces she usually kept hidden. How do you find your way back? He asked. How do you remember who you used to be? I don't think you go back, Emily said slowly, still working through the thought herself. I think you figure out who you are now, with all the scars and disappointments and unexpected strength. I think you build something new. Is that what you're doing here? Building something new? Emily looked around the empty study, with its potential for transformation, its promise of becoming something beautiful and meaningful. Maybe. Are you? Before Alexander could answer, Emily's phone rang. Michael's name flashed on the screen and she felt her stomach drop. She'd been so absorbed in her conversation with Alexander that she'd forgotten to call him the night before, as promised. I should take this, she said apologetically. Alexander nodded, stepping back to give her privacy, but Emily could feel him watching as she answered. Hi, Michael. Emily, thank God. I was starting to worry when you didn't call last night. Michael's voice carried the careful concern she'd grown to recognize. How are you? How's the job going? Emily glanced at Alexander, who was pretending to study the lake view while obviously listening. It's good. Challenging, but good. When do you think you'll be coming home? I know you said it was a big project, but I'm not sure yet. Emily interrupted. It's more complex than I initially thought. Complex how? Emily struggled for words that wouldn't be lies but wouldn't reveal the full truth either. That she wasn't just redesigning a house, she was redesigning herself. That for the first time in months, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Just lots of details to work through. I should probably stay focused on getting it right. There was a long pause. Emily, are you okay? You sound different. Different how? I don't know. More alive, I guess. It's been so long since I've heard you sound interested in anything. The observation hit Emily like a physical blow. Michael was right. She did feel more alive. But the fact that her husband could hear it in her voice after just 2 weeks away from him said something about their marriage that she wasn't ready to examine. The work is good for me, she said carefully. Creative challenges always were. I miss you, Michael said. And Emily heard the loneliness in his voice that mirrored her own struggles. I miss you too, she replied, though as the words left her mouth, she realized they felt more like a reflex than the truth. After she hung up, Emily found Alexander still at the window, his expression thoughtful. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. "Yes." Emily didn't elaborate, couldn't explain the complicated knot of guilt and relief and confusion that thinking about Michael created. "He loves you." "I know." "But?" Emily met Alexander's gaze, seeing understanding there that made her feel both grateful and terrified. "But love doesn't always fix things, does it? Sometimes loving someone means watching them hurt and not being able to help. Sometimes it means pretending to be okay when you're not, because admitting you're broken feels like admitting you're failing them." Alexander nodded slowly. "Sometimes it means building walls so high that even the people who love you can't climb over them." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, two people who had somehow found themselves in the middle of truths they hadn't planned to share. "The study," Emily said finally, gesturing to the room around them. "I think it should have built-in bookshelves, floor to ceiling, warm wood, maybe walnut, and a reading chair that's actually comfortable, not just impressive." Alexander smiled, and Emily realized it was the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd seen from him. "That sounds perfect." "And Alexander?" "Yes?" "Maybe it's time to start figuring out who you are when you're not performing. This space could be where you practice." As Emily gathered her materials to leave for the day, she felt the weight of what had passed between them. Not romance. They were both too wounded for that, too focused on survival and self-discovery. But understanding and the beginning of trust that felt precious and fragile and worth protecting. Walking back to the cottage, Emily realized she was looking forward to tomorrow in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything in years. Not because her life was fixed, but because it was finally genuinely changing. The first piece of furniture arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday morning that perfectly matched Emily's mood. She'd spent the night tossing in the cottage's comfortable bed, replaying her conversation with Michael and trying to untangle the growing complexity of her feelings about everything. Her marriage, her work, and the increasingly frequent moments when Alexander's presence made her forget about everything else. She was directing the delivery team through the placement of the custom walnut bookshelves when Alexander appeared in the doorway of his study, coffee in hand, and an expression of genuine surprise on his face. "They're perfect," he said, running his fingers along the smooth wood grain. "How did you know exactly what I had in mind when I didn't even know myself?" "It's my job to know," Emily replied, though she felt a warm flutter at his approval. "The books will make it feel lived in, personal." "About that," Alexander looked almost embarrassed. "Most of my books are in storage. I haven't had time to unpack them since I moved in." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You've lived here for 2 years and haven't unpacked your books?" "I kept telling myself I'd get to it when things slowed down at work." "And when exactly did you think that would happen?" Alexander's laugh was rueful. "Never, apparently. I've been waiting for permission to live in my own life." The observation hung between them, heavy with implication. Emily was about to respond when her phone rang. Michael again. She'd been avoiding his calls for 2 days, knowing she owed him a conversation she wasn't ready to have. "Take it," Alexander said quietly. "I'll supervise the furniture placement." Emily stepped into the main living area and answered. "Hi, Michael." "Emily, we need to talk." His voice was different, less patient, more direct than she was used to hearing from him. "I'm driving up to Seattle this weekend." "Michael, I don't think—" "No, listen to me." There was an edge to his voice that made Emily's stomach clench. "I've been patient. I've given you space to grieve, space to figure things out. But 3 weeks of barely talking to your husband isn't normal even for us." Emily felt tears prick her eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means we've been tiptoeing around each other for months, both pretending that losing the possibility of children didn't break something fundamental between us. It means I love you, but I don't know how to help you. And I'm starting to think you don't want my help anymore." The truth in his words cut deeper than anger would have. "Michael, I'll be there Saturday morning. We're going to have an honest conversation about where we go from here, because I can't keep living in limbo." The line went dead, leaving Emily staring at her phone with shaking hands. Behind her, She could hear Alexander's voice directing the furniture placement, the normal sounds of a life moving forward, while hers felt like it was fracturing apart. She walked to the window overlooking the lake, trying to steady her breathing. The gray water stretched endlessly, and Emily felt like she was drowning in the middle of it, too far from any shore to swim to safety. "Emily?" Alexander's voice was soft, concerned. "Is everything all right?" She turned to find him watching her with those perceptive green eyes that seemed to see too much. "My husband is coming to visit this weekend." Something flickered across Alexander's face. Disappointment, maybe, or worry. "That's good, isn't it? You must miss him." "I should miss him more than I do," Emily said, the admission falling out before she could stop it. "Does that make me a terrible person?" Alexander moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes. "It makes you human. Grief changes people, Emily. Sometimes it changes them in ways that relationships can't survive. We've been together for 5 years. We planned a whole life together. Plans change. People change." Alexander's voice was gentle but honest. "The question is whether you're changing in the same direction or growing apart." Emily felt tears threatening again. "I don't know how to be the person he fell in love with anymore. I don't even know if I want to be that person." "Who do you want to be?" The question was simple, but it hit Emily like a revelation. For months, she'd been focused on what she'd lost, the possibility of motherhood, the version of herself that had existed before disappointment changed her. But Alexander was asking about what she wanted to build, not what she wanted to recover. "I want to be someone who creates beautiful things," she said slowly, thinking aloud. "Someone who helps people figure out how to live better, more authentically. Someone who's not defined by what she can't do, but by what she can." "That sounds like exactly who you're becoming." Their eyes met, and Emily felt that electric charge again, the sense that Alexander saw her more clearly than she saw herself sometimes. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely inappropriate given that she was married to someone else. "I should get back to work," she said, stepping away from him before the moment could become something she wasn't ready to handle. "Emily, wait." Alexander's voice stopped her at the doorway. "Whatever happens this weekend, remember that you deserve to be happy. Not just content, not just going through the motions, actually happy." Friday evening arrived with a spectacular sunset that painted the lake in shades of orange and gold. Emily sat on the cottage's terrace nursing a glass of wine and trying to prepare for Michael's visit. She'd cleaned the cottage obsessively, as if external order could somehow create internal clarity. Alexander found her there as darkness fell, carrying his own glass of wine and wearing jeans and a sweater that made him look younger, more relaxed than his usual business attire. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Margaret's making dinner, but it won't be ready for another hour." Emily gestured to the chair beside her. "Please." They sat in comfortable silence, watching lights begin to twinkle across the lake as other people settled into their evening routines. Emily wondered what those lives looked like from the inside, whether other people felt as lost as she did, or if everyone else had figured out some secret to contentment that she'd missed. "Tell me about your marriage," Alexander said quietly, before everything got complicated. Emily considered deflecting, but something about the approaching confrontation with Michael made her want to speak honestly. It was good, easy, comfortable. Michael is kind and steady and patient. He made me feel safe. But I think I confused safety with happiness. I think I was so grateful to find someone who wouldn't hurt me that I never asked whether he could challenge me, inspire me, help me grow. Emily paused, swirling her wine. "And now I've grown anyway, in ways that don't include him, and I don't know how to bridge that gap." "Do you love him?" The question hung in the evening air like a challenge. Emily thought about Michael's careful kindness, his unwavering support through the fertility treatments, the way he'd held her while she cried over negative pregnancy tests. "I love who he is," she said finally. "But I don't think I'm in love with him anymore. Maybe I never was, not really. Maybe I was in love with the life we planned to build together. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. And now? Now I want different things. Now I want to feel alive instead of just safe. Now I want... She trailed off, not quite ready to voice what she wanted. What do you want, Emily? She turned to look at him, this complicated man who'd somehow become the catalyst for her transformation. I want to feel like myself again. I want to create things that matter. I want conversations that challenge me and work that fulfills me and... She paused, heart racing. I want to stop settling for good enough. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, an intensity that made Emily's breath catch. You shouldn't settle, he said quietly. You deserve more than that. The space between them felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Emily was acutely aware of how easy it would be to lean forward, to close the distance that separated them, to complicate everything irrevocably. Instead, she stood abruptly. I should go. Early morning tomorrow. Alexander rose as well, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the gathering darkness. Emily, he said, his voice rough with something she couldn't quite identify. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that these past few weeks, they've reminded me what it feels like to be myself again. Thank you for that. Before she could respond, before she could do something foolish like tell him that he'd done the same for her, Emily walked quickly back to the cottage. But as she prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change, and she wasn't sure whether that terrified or thrilled her more. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Emily's mood perfectly. She was in the main house's kitchen, making coffee with shaking hands when she heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, she watched Michael climb out of his familiar sedan, looking around at the estate with an expression she couldn't read. Alexander appeared beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. That's him? That's him. They watched Michael walk toward the main house, his posture uncertain, clearly out of his element in these surroundings. Emily felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was a good man walking into a situation he couldn't possibly understand. I'll make myself scarce, Alexander said quietly. But Emily, whatever you decide, make sure it's what you actually want, not what you think you should want. Before Emily could respond, the doorbell rang, echoing through the house like a judgment. She walked to answer it, her heart pounding with the knowledge that the next few hours would determine the direction of her entire future. Michael stood on the other side of the door, looking tired and worried and achingly familiar. Hi, he said simply. Hi, Emily replied and opened the door to let her husband into the life she'd been building without him. Emily led Michael to the cottage, hyper-aware of how the beautiful space might look to him, like evidence of a life she'd built without him, a sanctuary that didn't include space for their shared history. He stood in the main room, taking in the elegant furnishings and lake view, his expression unreadable. This is incredible, he said finally. No wonder you don't want to come home. Michael, it's not like that, isn't it? He turned to face her and Emily saw hurt mixed with determination in his familiar brown eyes. Emily, I've been watching you disappear for months, first into the grief over the fertility issues, then into this job. You're like a ghost of yourself except... He paused, studying her face. Except you don't look like a ghost anymore. You look alive in a way you haven't in years. Emily felt her throat tighten. I'm trying to figure things out. I know, but you're trying to figure them out without me. Michael sat heavily on the sofa, suddenly looking older than his 32 years. We used to talk about everything. Now I feel like I'm living with a stranger who's too polite to tell me she doesn't want to be married anymore. The words hung between them like a bridge Emily wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Do you think that's what I want? I think you want to be happy. I think you deserve to be happy. But I don't think you can be happy with me anymore. And I don't know how to fix that. Emily sat beside him, maintaining careful distance. You can't fix it, Michael. That's not your job. Then what is my job? As your husband, what am I supposed to do when the woman I love is clearly building a life that doesn't include me? The question broke Emily's heart because it was so earnest, so genuinely confused. Michael was a good man trying to love her in the only way he knew how, and it wasn't his fault that she'd outgrown the shape of that love. "You're supposed to let me go," she said quietly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "You're supposed to love me enough to let me become who I need to be, even if that person can't be your wife anymore." Michael was quiet for a long time, staring out at the lake. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Is there someone else?" Emily thought about Alexander, about the way he challenged her thinking, made her feel seen and understood, sparked something in her that felt like awakening from a long sleep. But whatever was developing between them was still too fragile, too uncertain to name. "It's not about someone else," she said truthfully. "It's about becoming someone else, someone I actually like being." "And you can't be that person with me?" Emily closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 5 years together of shared dreams that no longer fit either of them. "I don't think so. I think we became a habit instead of a choice, and habits aren't enough anymore." Michael nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this answer even if he'd hoped against it. "What do we do now?" "I don't know. I've never done this before." "Neither have I." Michael managed a small smile. "But I think maybe we start by being honest about what we both need." They talked for 2 hours, carefully dismantling 5 years of shared life with surprising gentleness. Michael would keep the apartment in Belltown. He'd always loved it more than Emily had. She would take her design business in whatever direction felt right. They would divide their possessions like civilized adults and try not to assign blame for growing in different directions. "I'll always love you," Michael said as he prepared to leave. "The version of you that I fell in love with and this new version that I'm just getting to know. I hope you find whatever you're looking for." "I hope you do too," Emily replied, meaning it completely. After Michael left, Emily sat on the cottage's terrace and cried. Not the desperate, angry tears she'd shed over her fertility struggles, but the clean, sad tears of something ending that had once been beautiful. She felt grief but also relief, and underneath both emotions something that might have been hope. Alexander found her there as the sun was setting, carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing an expression of careful concern. "How did it go?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "It went, honestly, maybe for the first time in months." Emily accepted the wine gratefully. "We're getting divorced." "I'm sorry." "Are you?" The question came out more direct than Emily had intended, but she found herself genuinely curious about his reaction. Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'm sorry that you're hurting. I'm sorry that something you both invested in didn't work out the way you hoped. But I'm not sorry that you're choosing authenticity over comfort. Even if it makes everything more complicated. Especially if it makes everything more complicated." Alexander's green eyes met hers. "Easy isn't always right, Emily. Sometimes the right choice is the hardest one to make." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and Emily felt something shift inside her. Not the desperate hope she'd carried during her fertility treatments, but a calm certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. "The West Wing is almost finished," she said eventually. "I know. What happens when the project is done?" It was the question Emily had been avoiding, the practical reality that her time at the estate had an expiration date. "I suppose I'll have to figure out what comes next." "What if what comes next could be here?" Emily turned to look at him, heart beating faster. "What do you mean?" "I mean the cottage is yours for as long as you want it. I mean there are a dozen other projects on the property that could use your expertise. I mean..." Alexander paused as if weighing his words carefully. "I mean I don't want you to leave." "Alexander, I know it's complicated. I know you just ended your marriage, and you need time to figure out who you are on your own. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." His voice was steady, but Emily could hear the vulnerability underneath. "I'm just asking you to consider staying. Building something here, with me, at whatever pace feels right." Emily felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different tears. Tears of possibility rather than loss. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to start over." "Neither do I," Alexander admitted. But I know that these past few weeks have been the first time in years that I've felt like myself. I know that you see me in a way that makes me want to be better than I thought I could be. I know that's worth figuring out together. Emily looked at the man beside her, complicated, successful, lonely Alexander who had somehow become the catalyst for her transformation. She thought about the empty West Wing they'd filled with warmth and possibility, about the conversations that had challenged her thinking, about the way he'd encouraged her to want more than just safety. What if we mess it up? She asked. Then we mess it up honestly, which is better than succeeding at something that was never really what we wanted. Emily laughed, recognizing her own words thrown back at her. You've been listening. I've been learning. From you. The space between them felt charged with potential, but also with patience. Alexander wasn't pushing for an answer, wasn't demanding promises she wasn't ready to make. He was simply offering possibility and letting her choose how to respond. I'd like to stay, Emily said finally. Not just for the work, but to see what we could build together. Slowly, carefully, but genuinely. Alexander's smile was radiant. I'd like that too. But I need time. Time to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be someone else's idea of perfect. We have time, Alexander said simply. We have all the time we need. As if to seal the promise, Alexander reached over and took her hand. Not a romantic gesture exactly, but an offer of partnership, of mutual support in figuring out what came next. Emily squeezed his fingers, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about the future. Not because she had it all figured out, but because she finally had the courage to build something real, something that honored who she was becoming, rather than who she used to be. 3 months later, Emily stood in the completed West Wing, admiring how the space had transformed. The walnut bookshelves were filled with Alexander's collection, finally unpacked and arranged by subject rather than size. The reading chair she'd chosen, oversized, comfortable, covered in soft leather, showed signs of regular use. Cooking smells drifted from the kitchen where Alexander was preparing dinner, a habit he'd rediscovered along with his books. The cottage remained Emily's sanctuary, but she spent most evenings in the main house now, working on new projects or simply talking with Alexander about everything and nothing. They'd kissed for the first time 2 weeks earlier, a gentle exploration that felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure simultaneously. Emily's divorce had been finalized the previous month. Michael had sent a card congratulating her on her new design business, which had grown through word-of-mouth recommendations from Alexander's wealthy neighbors. She was booked solid through the following year, creating homes for people who had everything except the knowledge of how to live authentically. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Torres. Your 3 o'clock appointment is here, the Henderson Project consultation. Emily gathered her portfolio and headed for the main house, passing the garden where she and Alexander had planted herbs together the previous weekend. She felt happy in a way that was entirely different from contentment, active, creative, constantly evolving happiness that came from building a life that actually fit who she was. Alexander appeared in the kitchen doorway as she passed, still wearing the apron that made him look domestic and approachable rather than intimidating. How'd the morning work session go? He asked. Good. I think the Petersons are going to trust me with their entire renovation. Emily paused to kiss him quickly, still marveling at how natural such gestures had become. What are you making for dinner? That pasta thing you like with the mushrooms, assuming you'll be done by 7? I'll make sure I am. Alexander smiled, the expression transforming his face from serious businessman to the man Emily was falling in love with. Carefully, deliberately, but completely. Good. I have something I want to discuss with you. Good something or complicated something. Potentially both, but definitely good. Emily felt her heart skip, not with anxiety, but with anticipation. Whatever Alexander wanted to discuss, she trusted that they could figure it out together. They'd built that trust slowly, conversation by conversation, choice by choice, until it felt as solid as the foundation of the house they shared. I'll see you at 7, she said, heading toward her appointment. As Emily walked toward her next project, she reflected on how much had changed in 6 months. She'd lost a marriage but found herself. She'd given up the safety of the familiar but gained something infinitely more valuable, the chance to build a life that was genuinely her own, shared with someone who saw and appreciated exactly who she was becoming. It wasn't the story she'd planned to write for herself, but it was better than any story she could have imagined. And for the first time in years, Emily was excited to see what the next chapter would bring.